Imagine this situation. A patient starts therapy. At first, everything goes well. The patient improves and starts to understand themselves better. Then suddenly everything changes. The patient says to the analyst, "I'm in love with you." Now what? Is this real love? Should the analyst stop the treatment? Or worse, respond to it? This is what Freud explores on one of his most famous technical papers from 1915 called Observations on Transference-Love. At the beginning of the paper, Freud says that beginners in psychoanalysis often feel worried about how hard is the interpretation of the patient's repressed thoughts, the complex decoding of dreams, the delicate untangling of childhood memories. But with time, they realize these difficulties are not so hard. Instead, they see that the real challenge in analysis is knowing how to handle the patient's emotional attachment to the analyst. In other words, the transference-love. In this paper, Freud explains that if a patient falls in love with the analyst, the public opinion is 1. They get married, which is rare. 2. They stop analysis and the treatment is destroyed, which is the common route. And Freud also states a third option for the sake of the analytic work to continue, which is the two people could start a private love affair that isn't meant to be permanent. But then Freud says that this is impossible because of society's rules and the professional standards that doctors must follow. In this paper, Freud says, let's look at what happens when a patient falls in love with their analyst and quits analysis because of it. Usually the patient eventually needs help again and goes to a second doctor. But then the same thing happens. The patient falls in love with the second analyst too. And if the patient tries a third time, it happens again. This pattern happens every single time. It's a key part of how psychoanalysis works. And it can be looked at it from two sides, from the analyst's perspective and from the patient's perspective. For the analyst, the situation is a helpful lesson and a warning. It reminds them to watch their own feelings and not get emotionally involved in return. The analyst must realize that the patient isn't falling in love with them because of their personality or looks, but because of the analytic situation. There is no reason for the analyst to feel proud or special about it. For the patient, there are only two choices. The patient either has to give up on analysis entirely, or the patient has to accept that falling in love with the analyst is simply part of the process. And this is where it gets statical. Freud noticed that this falling in love with the analyst usually happens exactly when the analyst is about to uncover a distressing, repressed memory. Suddenly, the patient loses all interest in the analytic work, and they only want to talk about their feelings for the analyst. Freud argues that this is resistance and the patient is trying to, 1. Destroy the doctor's authority by bringing him down to the level of a lover, 2. Prove her irresistibility, 3. Avoid the painful work of analysis by replacing remembering with acting out. So how should the doctor respond? Freud gives 3 common ideas. 1. The doctor tells the patient to be civilized and suppress the animal instincts, but Freud calls this senseless because in doing so contradicts the fundamental goal of psychoanalysis, which is to bring hidden feelings to light. 2. The doctor pretends to return the feelings, but Freud says analysis is founded on truthfulness. If a doctor gets caught in a lie, they lose their authority forever. Plus, Freud says humans are not that good at self-control and a psychoanalyst might actually fall for it. 3. Freud's solution is abstinence. This doesn't just mean not get intimate with the patient, but to maintain neutrality by keeping the analyst's own feelings and counter-transference in check, and allow the need and longing to persist in the patient's mind, so the analytic work can progress and changes can occur. Now, Freud also adds in this paper that some analysts tell their patients ahead of time that they will probably fall in love with them. Some even encourage it by saying, go ahead and fall in love with me so we can make progress in the analytic work. Freud says that this is a huge mistake because by telling the patient to do it, the analyst ruins the natural surprise element of those feelings. And when it isn't spontaneous, it's less authentic and it creates massive problems for the doctor later on. They are very difficult to fix. Now, is this transference-love fake? Freud says no. It is real, it's effective, it's compulsive, but it has three special features. One, it's provoked by the analytic work. Two, it's intensified by resistance. 3. It's blind to reality and consequences. Freud also says in this paper that this transference-love is not a new experience born from the present. Instead, it is a repetition of the past. Freud explains that if we look closely at the patient's behavior, we'll find it is entirely composed of copies of infantile reactions. It is a new edition of old traits. This is why it feels so compulsive and pathological. It is a ghost of an earlier relationship being projected onto the analyst because it is a repetition rather than a spontaneous new feeling born in the present moment. In this paper, Freud uses the phrase capacity for love is impaired by infantile fixations to describe the neurotic condition of the patient whose ability to love is currently hindered by early unconscious patterns. The analyst's primary aim is to help the patient to gain free command over this vital function. Freud insists that both ethical and technical motives must refrain the doctor from giving the patient his love. If the analyst were to gratify the patient's desires, the patient would dissipate the capacity for love within the confines of analysis. Instead, the goal of the analytic work is to help to keep the capacity for love ready for the real world, ensuring it is fully available when analysis is complete. Ultimately, to repair this impaired capacity for love, the patient must learn from the analyst to overcome the pleasure principle. The patient must practice giving up a satisfaction that is immediately available but socially unacceptable, which is a romantic relationship with the analyst in favor of a more distant one that is psychologically and socially acceptable. By guiding the patient through the early primal periods of their mental development without indulging these infantile cravings, the analyst helps the patient acquire the extra piece of mental freedom needed to finally bring the patient's deeply hidden erotic life into conscious control.